So like Roberta said, I'm from Qualia, the School for Deeper Learning. It's a school based just outside of Los Angeles. Just to give you an idea of what the classroom looked like when I ran these lesson plans, the classroom sizes are anywhere from 4 to 10 students. So I have a really small classroom. And we're primarily teaching students who are labeled as 2E or twice exceptional. What that means is essentially that many of our students have been labeled as gifted or profoundly gifted, along with having a learning difference. Perhaps they're on the autism spectrum, have dysgraphia, dyslexia, some learning difference. And so we teach philosophy at this school starting in 4th grade all the way through 12th grade. It is required at our school. And many of the teachers implement these lessons through games and game-based learning. So yeah, thanks for taking some time out of your evening to participate. Just to give us a basic idea, let's see here. Okay, so example lesson plans that I've used in the past. So we had a Tragedy of the Commons activity where essentially we had a little plate in the center of the table, and students were told that after every round, the amount of candy in the bowl would double. So we put a couple Jolly Ranchers in the center of the table. But everybody had a turn to take as many Jolly Ranchers as they would like. And then after that round, the candy would double. The kids were allowed to strategize, and for a while had said, well, let's let it accumulate quite a bit, and then we can all take a fair share at the end by the end. But inevitably, what had happened is that a small number of students had decided to take the whole lot of the candy in the center before it could double to any reasonable amount. And then we had a discussion about whether this was the right way of thinking about public spaces and things like the environment, or if this was a misguided way of thinking about public spaces. But this was supposed to be a sort of demonstration of this popular idea of the tragedy of the commons. Another lesson plan that we implemented once was we had given all of the students these short biographies of characters that they were meant to role play as. And all of these characters had radically different political beliefs, preferences, needs. So you might have had someone who required a lot of land because they were a farmer, they were a livestock farmer. And we had told them that this character wanted as few interventions from the federal government as possible. And you also had characters who lived in more urban areas and required a lot of public transportation in order to get to and from work. So we had sort of just a wide range of characters and scripted their sort of ethical preferences. And then we tasked the students with trying to come up with a set of rules that all of the people would be willing to agree to. This was sort of a build your own government activity. Another game that we played was this game that was supposed to model some of the ideas of Hobbes. And we essentially gave every student an unequal distribution of natural resources. So one student had a disproportionate amount of access to water, another one had a disproportionate access to wood, and all of these different resources, and they're crafting components. So you could combine different resources to generate either homes or wells or weapons, right? Students were able to declare war on each other and try and steal resources from one another. And the goal of the game was to accumulate as many resources as possible. Inevitably, a couple coalitions sort of emerged. And while some players were not able to have adequate resources to survive, others sort of concentrated all of the wealth and resources into the hands of a small number of players. The next game we played was a game of Werewolf. This is a game where you're given a secret identity. Perhaps you're a normal villager just trying to live your day-to-day life, or you might be a werewolf who at night wants to eat the other living villagers. And so you probably have played a game like this before. It sometimes gets called Mafia or something like that. But there's a phase where everybody closes their eyes, and the people in the werewolf team are allowed to eliminate one player from the game. This is them eating them in the middle of the night. And after they do that, everyone opens their eyes and is allowed to discuss who they think the werewolves might be, and try to vote them to exile them out of the village. The werewolves win if they can eat all the villagers, and the villagers win if they can exile all the werewolves. The trick was is that instead of using the game's prescripted method for voting people in and out of the village, we let students come up with their own rules for due process. Were you, for example, was it a consensus vote or a majority vote that was required to exile you? Did you get to speak on your behalf? Did you get to appoint a lawyer to speak on your behalf? Right. So the students were able to sort of come up with their own rules for due process in this game. We've tried to implement a number of prisoner dilemma games. There's this great game designer named Nikki Case. I highly recommend all of their resources online. And they've got this really cool app that you can use that will help you pit different strategies of a prisoner's dilemma against one another. And whoever has the most points will then sort of duplicate their strategy. And you can sort of see how strategies evolve over time. Super cool. I'd love to talk about that more later. And then last, we'll use tabletop role-playing games, games like Dungeons and Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, and other similar games like that, to embed students in long-form narrative stories that we sprinkle thought experiments throughout. So, for example, some of my students were, their city was being attacked by a dragon, and there were only a few boats, ships that were able to provide an escape, but they were not large enough to accommodate everyone, and so the students had to figure out who was of highest priority to save in an emergency situation. We ended up discussing different forms of like triage, the different criterion used for triage to inform their decision about who they think should be saved first when there's not adequate resources to give to everyone. Now I know I like sort of flew by those, but I just wanted to give like a sort of general flavor of like some of the types of lessons that we can give at this school. And then some questions that the entire staff have sort of thought about as we were trying different versions of these, all with their own like minor variations and different classroom sizes, different ages. These are sort of the common themes for a lot of the lesson plans. So I thought maybe this would be a good starting point for us to have our discussion. But one, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using characters with scripted ethical preferences versus the actual ethical beliefs of players, right? So in the Build Your Own Government game, I told players which ethical theories they were going to defend. Whereas in games like the Tragedy of the Commons or the Hobbes game, right? Players were allowed to make their own choices as players. They weren't role playing as a character, right? The second one was, how do you construct win conditions for games that don't presuppose the truth of certain ethical theories? Our Hobbes game was highly influenced by the fact that the win condition was accumulating as many resources as possible. That already sort of biased our students into thinking about maximum resource accumulation as like your primary goal. Whereas other students said, look, the goal in this game should just be to survive or to have an adequate number of resources, not to have maximum resources. Or the goal should be to promote the survival of as many people in your community as possible, rather than maximizing one's personal resources. So how do we make win conditions that don't sort of bias the thinking of the game from the start? Third question, how do you address bleed between the game and real life? This is a term that like people who work in like game design will talk about, or, bleed here means, there are certain emotions that I might feel either as a character or while playing a game that can sort of influence how I treat people outside of the game space as well, right? The guy who played, Joffrey from Game of Thrones received all sorts of hate mail and death threats, right? People, even if we acknowledge that no, this was a character he was playing, the actor is actually a really nice guy. We still we're biasing ourselves to sort of treat them similar to their character, right? This happened in a game that we were running. One of the people who stole all the candy from the Tragedy of the Commons activity, some people accused, her of being quite selfish. And I had to sort of intervene and say, we sort of set up the game to make this a viable option, right? Let's separate the game space from the real life space. And then lastly, how do you create reward systems that are that authentically motivate players without compromising an equitable classroom experience and student evaluation? So some specific examples here is when we ran that prisoner's dilemma activity, we lifted it from an article from the journal Teaching Philosophy. And there was one professor in there who had actually used student grades as the reward system for prisoners' dilemmas, right? You actually got extra credit if you won the prisoner's dilemma. You lost points on your final score when you lost interactions in the prisoner's dilemma. Almost the entire staff at our school thought that that's probably not the best way to go about providing a reward or an incentive structure for students, especially as they explore different strategies in the prisoner's dilemma. But if we use something like candy, I know as trivial as it sounds, you had some kids who said, "Well, actually, I don't think I'm really going to be motivated that much because I don't like Jolly Ranchers. I would have participated if these were Tootsie Rolls, but because they're Jolly Ranchers, I actually don't really feel that compelled to play the game normally, right?" So how can we think about reward systems that do provide like the utility that students want in order to be incentivized to play the game, but are not going to compromise like an equitable classroom evaluation or experience, right? I've been rambling, but these are sort of four questions I thought we might be able to use to get started. So I guess I'll go ahead and pass it off to Roberta. You're our facilitator for this evening, right? Oh, and I think you're muted. Hmm. Oh, I think you're still muted.
I was going to say that you're actually in charge of the discussion
Oh,
since,
fantastic.
yeah, it's better if the presenter who knows the material better. So why don't you
Yeah, that's
um,
great.
get it started?
Yeah, that sounds great. So the order of these questions was relatively random. Does anybody have any thoughts about any of these four questions or some other thoughts about any of these lesson plans?